moved here by the glaciers from southwestern Minnesota. And it's only like a couple billion years old. And when the glaciers pulled back, they left it sitting on the banks of the Shunganunga Creek in Topeka. And somebody enterprisingly from Lawrence in the 1920s said, that would look good in Lawrence. Let's just go over and get it. So one night they went over and let her on a train car, brought her back here. And had been sitting downtown ever since. So it really had nothing to do with Lawrence, no connection to Lawrence at all. And the call came along and said, we'd like that back. It's our sacred rock. And so they said, okay, fine. And they moved it down to Council Grove. And I don't know if it's the park set up yet or not, but that's where it is. And so they're trying to come back with money that they've gotten from their casinos. And that's an interesting question. We'll talk about that a little later. So that's the okay, let's talk about the reservation system. And initially, as I said, in the 1830s and 40s in Oklahoma, or Indian Territory, it wasn't great, but it wasn't a disaster that became later on. The tribes held the land in common, so nobody could sell their land. They didn't have a piece of their land to sell. It was all held together, so they were able to use the resources. Then they said, as they moved out, as I said, the Pawnee got shoved farther north, Kansas got shoved farther west. That opened up land around here for other tribes to occupy. Those reservations were quite a bit smaller. And the idea all along was to convert the Indians assimilate them into the white culture by making them farmers. Even though they had no history as farmers, a lot of them, they weren't given the tools they needed to be farmers, or the training. Being a farmer is tough anyhow in Kansas. You're dependent on the weather, crop prices, even if you know what you're doing. If you know what you're doing, you have no chance. And they didn't, by and large. So they were supposed to be given food allocations by the federal government. And sometimes those happened, and sometimes they didn't. Or sometimes the Indian agent would skim some off the top, or just lose it all. And then we found out by that time the tribe was starving. So the reservation system, they weren't what they got to be later on. One of the reasons the Indians were put out here in the first place was that explorers, Lewis and Clark they didn't see much Kansas. They stayed on the river. So they really didn't see what was beyond the bluffs. John Fremont and Zebulon Pike, maybe two of them, came across Kansas, and maybe they did, I don't know what time of year they did it, maybe it was in August when it was like 105, and it had rained for like a year and a half. So they came back and said, this is the great American desert. It'll never be anything. So, of course, the people watching said, great, perfect place for Canadian Americans. Put them out there. And then, of course, when they turned out to be not the case, and the whites wanted the land, then they had to do something else with the Native Americans. And then it was like, okay, first of all, we're going to put them all out in Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma. That's why if you ever look at a map, there's a chain of what at that time were frontier forts. You know, Fort Madison, Iowa, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, Fort Scott, Kansas, Fort Smith, Arkansas, all lined up there. That was supposed to be the edge of civilization. Out here with Native Americans. Well, once the railroad came through and California was acquired, that all gone. And so had to have a new plan. So put them in Oklahoma. You can tell that by looking at a map of reservations. Missouri has no reservations. Arkansas has no reservations. Illinois has no reservations. Iowa's just got a couple little ones right in the middle of the state. Nebraska has some, Kansas has some, Oklahoma has a lot. Texas has none. So they're all got moved out here and then dumped. We have tribes here in Kansas, like the Potawatomi, it started off in the North Woods of Michigan. And there are still bands of Potawatomi up there. And there are still reservations in Michigan, in Wisconsin, and Minnesota, up in the northern part, the Piney Woods. They aren't really good for anything else, so they got to keep their land. But outside of that, they've had to make the best they can. The Delaware were the first ones to come out here, and they got the biggest chunk of land. Years ago, when we bought our house, which is in Old West Lawrence, I looked at the abstract of title, which is, they don't use that anymore, but it was like this thick, all the prior owners. The initial owner of that land was a Delaware Indian, who had it for a while and then sold it or lost it. But that was the first owner of record of that land. Probably this church too, I don't know. The reservation system was supposed to be a way to help Indians out. And in theory, that was maybe possible. In practice, it never worked. It never worked. It got worse as time went on, too. Thanks to a man who was an Indian Kansan, Charles Curtis. He was a congressman and came up with a plan to subdivide the reservations. It was just a total disaster. Save something for next week. Let's talk about treaties for a minute. A lot of movies, TV shows will show the process of treaties being entered into by representatives of the U.S. government or Army officers and chiefs. And there'd be solemn promises made, and the Indians would get money or trade goods like iron pots or axe heads or knives or blankets or just things they've been needing. And they would sign this paper, which they probably couldn't read, giving up land rights, which they didn't understand. But that's the idealized version. And what happened in practice was you had treaties being made by locals, farmers, local settlers, the mayor of a town would go out and make a treaty, and then would take it back to Washington and say, hey, we need to approve this treaty. Okay, so they would. And so you ended up having multiple treaties covering the same land. The only loser of that was the Native Americans. Whoever won was going to be them. And that's how things, and then it eventually took a while, but eventually they figured out what the deal was. And so when it came time for the Sioux to sign off on their rights to the Black Hills, they said, no, we're not going to do that. You can't make this. Well, they just took it anyhow. But the whole treaty concept was just totally flawed, because again, I mentioned Native Americans had no concept of, this is my land, this is your land. We draw a line right here, that's my land. They didn't think like that. And to make them, expect them to think like that was, well, we knew better. The U.S. government knew better. But they did it anyhow. Next week we'll talk about the final destruction, I guess you could say, of the reservation system starting in the 1880s and 90s. And marginally. But as I was looking through this whole sorry history of reservations, I was looking for one uplifting story I could find. The only one I could find was marginally uplifting. It did not happen in Kansas, it happened in New Mexico. In the 1860s, they decided that they were going to move the Navajo from the northwest part of the state down to plains of eastern New Mexico, which if you've ever been out there, make western Kansas look like a garden spot. But they moved 8,000 men, women, and children, not very far, just across New Mexico, so it was only about 300 miles, out to a place in western eastern New Mexico called the Apache Woods, Wadi Apache. And it's still there. It's kind of a geological oddity. It's an oasis kind of a thing. Groundwater from the Rio Grande River, which flows not too far away. There are trees, and it looks very inviting. And so they thought, well, we'll put them out there and they could farm. Well, the problem with that was, A, they were sheep herders and not farmers. They had no idea how to farm. B, there were too many out there anyhow. Even if the plan had worked, there were too many people occupying the area. C, the water table, yeah, there was fresh water, it went down about this far. And once you drain that off, the alkaline water, which was heavier, was down below, and it got sucked to the top. So after a couple of years, you had no water. They lost their first crop because of grasshoppers, second crop because of drought. By the third year, they were starving. They had a dishonest agent in charge of the project. So finally, things got bad enough. William becomes a Sherman, not normally a bleeding heart. Came out, he's out there for a day, looked at it and said, okay, shut it down. Send it back. This isn't working. So they had to go back. And they've been back there in northwestern Oklahoma, New Mexico, and northeastern Arizona ever since. That's about the only time that the reservation system has been abandoned as being totally not working. It took, until people died. People died. But if William comes to Sherman and says, this is bad, you know it's got to be bad. So that's the one uplifting story I could come up with on reservations. That's all I've got for today, folks. So thanks for coming. Other questions?